The other day I discussed some of the many different meditation techniques that there are. To recap on that, then there's this sort of induction meditation, which is a sort of thing that a yoga teacher will do at the end of a yoga class. They'll guide you through a visually prompted meditation. And this evokes a kind of artificial feeling in the student, or induces them into a kind of trance-like state. It's a sort of form of hypnotism. And then we've got the meditations of shamatha, and most meditation falls into this category. And shamatha is used to still the mind, also to create strength of mind. Now, this first type, induction, also falls into the category of shamatha because we're using the teacher's voice as our focus. The teacher's voice as our focus. So it basically is the same thing. And then there's this final category, and that was the meditations that help to break down one's own conceptual imputations. And it's this final state where one is free of all conceptual imputations that we rest in the unborn wisdom, the Buddha nature. And this is what we call vipassana. And as far as I can see, then there are very few meditations that actually fall into this category. One is the meditation on Mahamudra, an authentic meditation on Mahamudra or Dzogchen, and also this sort of meditations that come about from the direct instruction or pith instruction of a lama to a student. And this seems to happen within the Zen tradition, but it's basically kind of undocumented or secret. It's a one-to-one, very personal interaction. Now, in that video, then I talked a little bit about the idea that many spiritual communities are founded on personality cults. And that kind of sounds like a negative thing, but it's not as bad as it seems. In fact, there are very many benign examples of personality cults. J. Krishnamurti was a perfect example of this. He did not call himself a teacher or a guru, but through his eloquence and charisma, then he drew many followers into his presence. And through the eloquence of his speech, then he induced a kind of hypnotic meditation into his students. And when I say that a personality cult is not so much founded on a valid teaching, but on the character of an individual, this does not necessarily mean that that teacher doesn't have a valid philosophical position to present. It merely means that the community is held together by the charisma of the teacher. And it is the case that pretty well all spiritual traditions are founded by a personality. We have Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, the Semitic religions like Christianity and Muslim and Judaism, and these have all persisted over time because of the strength and the validity of the teachings, and not so much on the personality of the individual who founded those traditions. For example, the Buddha, having attained enlightenment, attracted many thousands of students to his feet to listen to his teachings. But to this day, the Buddhist tenet remains. Not only that, but the teaching itself may withstand scrutiny from other philosophical scholars, also from scientists and psychologists. And so, when I say a community like Rupert Spears is primarily focused on his personality and not so much on the teachings, that is in no way to disparage the validity of those teachings. As far as I can tell, Rupert Spear is more or less presenting the same philosophical tenet as Francis Lucille. It is the Kashmir Shaivik tradition, and this is a long-founded and long-standing spiritual tradition. And it is the case that the validity of those teachings have withstood the test of time. The point I'm trying to make is that once these teachers such as Rupert Spear and Eckhart Tolle pass from this world, it is unlikely that their teachings will remain in perpetuity based on the strength of their philosophical position alone. Their teachings are derived from various other spiritual traditions, and so have no distinct message of their own. Now, it is possible that 1,000 years from now, there will still remain something called Rupert Spearism or Eckhart Tolleism, but it is highly unlikely. What we know is that certainly within the next 100 or 200 years, then as long as humanity exists, things like Christianity and Hinduism will still persist. If we look at a historical figure in modern times, then Gurdjieff at one time was a very popular spiritual teacher. But I have to say that the only people I've met who follow his teachings are now either dead or very elderly. It is seldom that you hear young spiritual practitioners refer to Gurdjieff, even though 50 or 60 years ago he was quite popular. Also, there are few people who would be able to recount to you the pith, instruction, or meaning of his teachings. It is still the case that there are people you can ask who are able to explain what it is J. Krishnamurti was primarily teaching. Most will say that his main point was not that you needed to practice, but you had to develop rationale and clarity of mind. And these are very sound principles. But I doubt that within another 100 years there will be any reference to something called J. Krishnamurtiism. No teachings that will remain distinct other than an archive of videos on YouTube, if such a thing exists in the future. The other day, I roughly described some different types of meditation techniques and tried to give you an idea of how these could be beneficial in your practice. Further, this is highly dependent upon the student-teacher relationship, and it is based on the skill of the teacher that a student can be drawn or led to the final truth. But today, I wanted to talk about the faults of meditation, also the counterindications, the way in which meditation can go wrong, and the common misconceptions that people develop from a mistaken spiritual path. So in general, in the Buddha Dharma, it is taught that there are two principal mistakes in any meditation. One is called dullness, and the other is called agitation. Dullness is a feeling of sleepiness when the mind is turned inwards and the senses become rather indistinct. And this is the most common fault that people fall into, especially in the West. And in the text, there are many techniques that are given to help a practitioner who is falling under the sway of this first fault of dullness in their meditation. First, instead of closing your eyes, you should keep your eyes open. Also, open a window to let some fresh air into the room, and remove some of your clothing so the body doesn't get too hot. These are all ways to avoid this fault of dullness in meditation. Now, this second fault, which is called agitation, is a state in which the mind becomes very busy. What it is that by meditation, one's awareness becomes very acute. But instead of remaining with the clarity of the mind, then one starts to think too many thoughts and get carried away. So, if you're meditating and you try to focus your mind on one object or one idea, then the mind gets carried away with thoughts. And in doing that, then we're no longer able to focus ourselves. But this is a much less common fault in meditation. For most people, they don't gain clarity in their meditation. What they do is they become very sleepy and their senses turn inwards and everything becomes indistinct. And so, as you know, that I've been doing a little bit of research online these days. I've been kind of out of the loop for at least 13 years, and in that time, then the spiritual landscape has changed greatly in the West. For example, I mentioned many times I was quite surprised to hear of this phenomena called celebrity awakening. Many people online are claiming to have something called initial awakening or experiences of enlightenment. So naturally, having spent tens of thousands of hours dedicating my time to meditation in a retreat environment, I'm skeptical when I hear Westerners say that awakening is something easy to achieve. And so naturally, I would like to share my insights and beliefs into just why there's this modern phenomena of declaring non-dual awakening. And this is directly related to these two faults of meditation that I previously mentioned, that of dullness and of agitation. Now first, we have to understand that meditation has a very real and physical effect on the body. And this is something that has been recently supported by medical research and also led to the proliferation of something called mindfulness. So we know that when we meditate, we create chemicals in the brain like dopamine and serotonin. And these chemicals help us to feel sensations of bliss and happiness and well-being, but also reduce our clinging to self and reality phenomena. You may have heard of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems in the body, and certain chemicals will create sympathetic or parasympathetic reactions. To clarify what I mean by this, the sympathetic reaction is what we call the fight or flight reaction. That is when the body becomes alert and very responsive, and extra blood is pumped to the muscles in case one needs to run away or fight one's enemy. The parasympathetic reaction is often called the rest and digest response. And so this is when animals, having a full belly, will then go to their dens and become quiet and digest their food or rest up after a long term of exertion. Now seemingly these two responses are very different and contrary to each other. But when we look at chemicals such as marijuana, then they can create either of these two responses in the individual. For example, if you take low levels of THC, it may help to create the sympathetic response. The sympathetic response makes one more alert and also primed for action. However, if one takes large quantities of THC or marijuana, then one triggers the parasympathetic response. And this is the traditional concept we have about marijuana, that if you smoke a lot of marijuana, you will kind of fall asleep or become very dozy. Now, our meditation also has these kind of effects, because if we have lots of dopamine in the brain, then eventually it will make us feel sleepy. And this explains why many meditators have this problem of dullness in their meditation. Their senses turn inwards, they become very dull, and sounds, external sounds for example, start to become indistinct. Just as when we smoke marijuana, then when we meditate, we increase the levels of dopamine in our brain. If this persists over a long period of time, then it has the parasympathetic response, and so people start to fall asleep. This explains why, for many people in meditation, they have this problem of nodding off. So as part of my investigation into finding out where Westerners are on the spiritual path, then recently I joined a local group who gather on Sundays to meditate. And I noticed that most of the people in the room were suffering from this fault of dullness. In fact, many of them were falling asleep. And when they meditated also, they meditated as in the Theravada tradition, so they meditated with the eyes closed. And having the eyes closed, as I said, will promote this feeling of dullness. Also in the Hindu tradition, then they often try to create this sense of stillness. It's very similar to the relaxation we do at the end of a yoga class. For example, the Hindu teacher will say, Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace. So this is a kind of hypnotism, right? And what we are inducing through this type of meditation is this kind of parasympathetic effect. So it's a kind of sleepiness and dullness. Now we have to admit that we like sleep. We really enjoy it. And we get a real kick out of deep sleep. If you've had a really good deep sleep, undisturbed, then you always feel refreshed. And we are attached to this. Many forms of meditation promote this state of deep sleep. And along with this parasympathetic effect, then we have these feelings of bliss. These feelings of bliss arise out of the chemicals that are created in the brain during meditation. For many people, they see this to be the ultimate meditation object. And when they get into a sort of trance-like state, either induced by the teacher or through whatever meditation they do, then they become very attached to that. And what happens in meditation generally is that if feelings arise and we like them, then we kind of try to intensify those feelings. We seek out these feelings of pleasure. And why is it we do that? Well, these suggestions are implanted in us by the teachers. They make suggestions like there's this state of peace or stillness. They talk about experiences of bliss and well-being, or kind of divine happiness that arises out of meditation. So naturally, when we sit on our cushions, we go looking for these things. And if these things don't exist, then we unintentionally create them, we fabricate. And this is a big problem, and I spoke about this, mentioned it in the recent video, is that fabrication is one of the biggest obstacles to meditation. And that's why, in the Tibetan tradition anyway, we don't value this interaction where the teacher tells you how it is, or tries to suggest something to you, how your meditation should be, what you should feel. We don't tell people to go looking for things, and we don't try to induce this into them. But anyway, what happens is we have this principle that we've heard about in spiritual path, and we sit on our cushions, then we try to find that or create that happiness or well-being. And then when it comes to something like the natural essence or the true nature of mind, then we're also very keen to find out what that is. If something appears to mind like a feeling or sensation of bliss or non-thought, we become attached to that. And as I said in a previous video about the 3 experiences of meditation, those are bliss, clarity, and non-thought, that if you get attached to those, it creates rebirth in the mundane world. So what does that mean, rebirth in the mundane world? It means our mundane experiences arise out of these attachments, right? So we live in what's called the desire realm, and it's our attachment to the things that we like that fabricates our experience, our worldly experience. And likewise, by attachment to non-thought, then we fabricate this experience of the formless realm. Now, what is the formless realm? It's this state of no perception. And actually, this state of no perception is quite attractive, especially if you've got a lot of thoughts, if you have a lot of hang-ups, if you have a lot of regrets, if you have a lot of bitter memories in your past, then non-thought allows you to escape from that. The problem is, by escaping into that, you cause yourself to experience more mundane suffering. It does not liberate you from mundane suffering. So where am I going here? Well, this is a well-known phenomena. And my point of reference is Samyeling Monastery. If you've not heard of Samyeling Monastery, then it was the first Tibetan temple in the West. So in the 50s, then 3 lamas left Tibet and came to the West. That was Akwang Rinpoche, Chogyam Trungpa, and Chimi Rinpoche. And the 3 of them came to England, and eventually Akwang Rinpoche and Trungpa founded Samyeling. So it was one of the first places that Westerners were introduced into Tibetan meditation and Tibetan Buddhism. And they were basically all hippies. And many of them are still alive, and they're absolutely wonderful. They were literally people who had been on the hippie trail, and they came back to England, and then they found or discovered Samyeling, and it became a haven of hippiedom. And so these kind of faults in meditation, the way that spiritual paths can go wrong, is well documented in the history of Samyeling. And where people go wrong is primarily associated with these 2 experiences, these 2 mistaken experiences in meditation, dullness and agitation. So Lama Yeshe is the abbot of Samyeling. He's a Tibetan and a yogi, and he has many, many thousands of hours of experience in meditation. Not only that, he's somebody who understands Mahamudra meditation. Over the years, Lama Yeshe has become very familiar with the faults of Westerners' meditation. And this is one of them. This is this fault of dullness. And what he says to his students is, look at you, you're all spaced out, wake up. So what he was identifying there is this state that beginners get into when they first start to meditate. They sit in shamatha, and then they try to still the mind. They get this sort of blissful, tranquil feeling, and they kind of want to disappear into that. And their meditation becomes more and more dull, like a state of sleep. And if you do that for prolonged periods of time, what happens in your waking life is you have this kind of dreamlike experience of everything around you. So this dreamlike experience is not the dreamlike experience that's spoken about by the bodhisattvas. The bodhisattvas have realized emptiness, so the world is not solid. It doesn't mean that they're in a kind of sleepy dream. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's absolute mental clarity. If you understand what clarity is, then it's the exact opposite from this kind of mystical trance-like state that people are talking about. And Lama Yeshe identified this right away. How did he identify it? Because he is meditation master. He's somebody who spent 20 years or something in retreat on his own, practicing like his head was on fire. He was one of the most diligent practitioners you can ever imagine. And on the basis of this, he's a real expert in meditation. He understands it completely, inside out. And so he could identify that what these Westerners have done is they've gone down the wrong path. They've fallen into this dullness, this fault of meditation. By pursuing that, then it gives you this kind of hypnotized, trance-like effect. It's very similar to the effect that Krishnamurti had on his students. They would follow him around, and then listening to the eloquence of his speech, they become entranced and they become attracted to that feeling because it's a feeling of tranquility. But this is not the feeling that we're talking about in the Buddha Dharma. This dreamlike trance, that's not how it is. It's not about being asleep. It's about recognizing the empty nature of phenomena, how things aren't really solid. And so it's a hyper-intensive form of wisdom or intelligence. It is not a doziness. And so recently, then hearing people's comments, that I can identify that it seems, anyway, to me, that most or not all of these people claiming spiritual awakening these days are referring to this kind of parasympathetic effect of going into a dreamlike daze. So how does it differ? Well, as I said, when we talk about dreamlike, it's not like a sleepy, kind of vague experience. The experience is intensely lucid and very aware. But on the basis of having this very sharp intellect and awareness, then you recognize the subtle impermanence of phenomena. So it's a very sharp and present experience. It's not kind of a dreamlike or mystical experience. And then people talk about this feeling of no self. Well, when they describe it, what it sounds like is a kind of numbness. It's a sort of numbness you feel if you take antidepressants. So people who are very neurotic or very upset, then they're often prescribed medication. mood-altering medication. And this instills a kind of numbness or dullness, and you can identify it in people. And it's almost identical to the way people act who feel like they're awakened, who've gone down this mistaken path. And how do I know this? Well, I've seen question and answer sessions online between teachers and their students, and many of the teachers act in this way. It's almost like they're on kind of, I don't know what they're called, like Quaaludes or something like that. It's the antidepressants and things. It makes you kind of sleepy and a little bit confused. And so they'll ask questions, and while they're asking questions, they kind of close their eyes. It's a bit like somebody who's half awake. And that's the exact opposite of spiritual realization or awakening. We call it awakening because it's the most lucid and vibrant experience of awareness. It's not a feeling of sleepiness or drowsiness. And then also people describe this feeling of not being interested in the world. Now we call this experience of not being interested in the world or rejecting the world is called renunciation. So this renunciation, this feeling of renunciation is not a feeling of apathy, sort of like, well, everything's a dream, it doesn't matter. It's kind of this neutral, not engaging with life. There's no point in this, there's no point in that. That's not the experience of renunciation. This experience that we're taught about turning away from the world is not this dull and apathetic state. The experience of renunciation is a very vivid experience. What happens when people realize renunciation is they become laser focused on this goal of emancipation, of liberation from samsara. So they don't become kind of unresponsive or uninterested in the world. They become very interested and very focused on what's important. And so again, it's the exact opposite of the experience that people describe online of their awakening, which is a kind of mystical experience of energy with this kind of non-engagement in the world, like walking around in a dream. Those are exactly the opposite. Now, why does this happen? It happens because of the point I made in the previous video. A teacher teaches us their tradition. For example, Rupert Spear says, there is no self, there's no work to do. So we hear these words, and then when we're practicing, we try to fabricate an understanding of that. You could say to somebody, there's no path to tread, there's no journey, there's no discipline. And we can interpret that different ways. For example, we can interpret as no discipline means I can do whatever I want. Or no path, well, it means I can be lazy. We can interpret it that way, or we can interpret it the correct way in terms of the Dharma. And that means being attached to the concepts of discipline and journey and path, being goal-oriented, is counterproductive to meditation. But what kind of meditation is that counterproductive to? Very high level of meditation, not for beginners. So people who sort of start doing the spiritual thing for a few months and then they become awakened are really kidding themselves on. It's not like that. And it's not just in spiritual paths, Buddhism, it's not just in these philosophical schools. You see this in your basic Tai Chi or yoga class, purely physical stuff. People will do a 1 week intensive for the first time in their life and they walk away from it and they feel like they're walking on a cloud. They have an experience of groundlessness, right? Now this experience of groundlessness, this is another really good example of how we mistake the Dharma. We hear there is no ground, there's no reference points, there is no ground. This is what we hear. And then we sit in meditation and we try to fabricate what that might mean. We associate it with particular feelings that arise. One thing you should understand is that a realization, understanding, experience of the true nature of reality and emptiness is not associated with feelings. Feelings are appearances. Appearances are not to be taken seriously. So anyway, we have this idea of groundlessness. And so what we interpret it as is kind of like walking on a cloud, right? This feeling of being unfocused. The world isn't real. This is what we say groundlessness. That's not what somebody who has realized groundlessness or no reference points will experience. Somebody who understands this idea that there are no reference points, that there is no ground, has a hyper-acute awareness. They have an understanding of the subtle impermanence of nature. So it's like your awareness being very, very sharp. What this does is it exponentially increases your intellect. I don't mean in a conceptual way. I mean, when you were young, you could pick up ideas really quickly, right? Young children, when you're around them, you notice that their intellect is so sharp. Somebody who experiences groundlessness does not feel like they're walking on a cloud or in a dream. They feel hyper-intelligent, hyper-aware. The strength of mind is phenomenal. The realization of groundlessness is the understanding of subtle impermanence of phenomena. It's the same as the realization of emptiness. And emptiness isn't a feeling like nothing exists or nothing is important. Emptiness is what we call wisdom and compassion in union. And that's not a simple thing. And it's not something that's just going to come about from doing yoga for a week or something like that. So you really have to understand this. And why do I say that? Because all this stuff was going on 40, 50 years ago in Western spiritual communities. And for example, Lama Yeshe identified this in his students, and to this day, he always tells people off. The minute he sees they're getting spaced out, like if they're sitting in meditation and they're looking a bit spaced out, and he tells them off. And why does he do that? To wake them up. He says something very sharp, and it's a very skillful type of meditation instruction, and they sort of wake up and they realize that they're drifting off into this kind of no man's land. And actually this is a massive obstacle to your meditation, because what will happen is you'll spend 10, 20, 30 years developing this kind of apathy in your meditation, this dullness, this sleepiness, and it will reduce your intelligence, it will reduce your awareness, and basically you've wasted all your time. I mean, the side effects of this agitation thing are quite negative, but they're not really going to waste as much time as the dullness stuff. For example, you can be focused on a mistaken meditation object. Let's say you've misunderstood the true nature of reality. You think you're meditating and you think, oh, I've realized emptiness. And then you sit on your cushion for 20 years focusing on that object, but it's a mistaken object, right? This is the point. You've misunderstood, you've identified something in your meditation, and you've focused on it diligently. That will increase your shamatha meditation. That will increase your shine. It will actually be beneficial to your basic foundation of meditation. It will make you very sharp, it will increase your intellect, and it will put you in a good position for progressing. However, if you spend 20 years just drifting off into this dozy, sleepy, mystic, space-like meditation, you'll just waste your time, and also you'll make yourself less intelligent. You kind of become stupid, really. It's what happens to people. They're spaced out. They're kind of stupid. You know, you could say, hey, Carrie, hello. And they don't really know you're talking to them because they've become kind of spaced out. That's not a positive thing in meditation, honestly, 100%. You need to understand this. And as far as I can tell, all these people claiming awakening are talking about this very basic mistake in meditation that is totally beginner level. It's beginner of beginner level. Somebody who has a slight understanding of meditation is like light years ahead of somebody who's stuck in this kind of drifty dreamland. You need to know this, and I have to be very direct. And why am I saying it? It's because I don't want you to waste 20, 30 years of your time. I want you to invest your time in practice, and by that, gain realization. Why? Because realization is liberation from samsara. And liberation from samsara means you've no longer got suffering. Many people claim that you can awaken, but you still have basic mundane suffering. And that's because they've misunderstood what awakening is. They think awakening is this dull, sleepy, kind of dreamlike state. So naturally, if you're kind of dozing out and spaced out, and then you get this pain in your stomach, it's going to irritate you. It's not going to help one bit. But if you're awakened to the true nature of reality, then you no longer have suffering. I don't want anybody to suffer. And so I will do my best, even if you dislike what I'm saying, and it makes you kind of criticize me, and I'm willing to put up with that for the very slight off chance that it might help you to progress in your practice. So those are the counterindications for getting caught up in this dullness in meditation. What are the counterindications for agitation? Well, people tend to become a bit neurotic, right? Unsettled and neurotic, if they go with this agitation part of the meditation. But it's not really a danger, because you sit down in meditation and you've got too many thoughts, let's say. I'm thinking about all kinds of things, and you feel like you just can't meditate. But that doesn't persist. That really doesn't persist, and you don't really get carried away by it. There are some people, especially if they meditate on high views, They meditate on really high views, and then they start thinking all kinds of things, and it can drive people crazy. Literally, they go nuts. They get really neurotic, and they start saying all kinds of weird things. And it's usually because they've heard this thing like, there is no self, and they think they understand that. And then when they go to the pharmacy or the drugstore, they've got this problem, because there's this self who's trying to buy stuff, etc. So everything they do in their life is in contradiction to this borrowed view. They've heard from somebody else. The teacher has induced it in a guided meditation, and they think they have to believe that. And so they start doing strange things like not using the word I, me, mine. I don't exist. I better not say I, Where are you going? I'm going to the drugstore. Going to the drugstore. They change their language, and it makes you a bit crazy. But actually, there's very few people who suffer from that. I heard of one student of Taiseti Rinpoche who actually went nuts because of this. And I've met a few people who have become a bit strange through meditation in this way, become really agitated and thinking too much. But 99% of people fall into this dullness category. What are you looking for? You're looking for clarity. Also, you shouldn't cling to clarity, but what does that mean? Well, that means your eventual goal is clarity, emptiness. But again, I shouldn't say these things, because if I say, the clear light nature of mind, then when you meditate, you're going to try to look for some light in your meditation. That's a big mistake. And that's why I said on this direct path, and we don't do that. We don't give suggestions to students. Like the other day, I was listening to somebody, he was teaching a student, the student made a question, and the question gave a sincere answer right away, and the teacher said, no, it's like this. It's like they corrected them, said, no, your experience is invalid, it's like this. And they're telling them what to think. And if that person didn't believe it, and then they have to believe what I'm saying, then they've got to sit in meditation and find some way to accommodate that, right? And I better believe that then. The teacher said there's no self, but I feel like there's a self. So, okay, how can I make a no self? And that's what we do. It's just natural, it's human, especially if we have this respect for these teachers, right? We've got personality cults. The person sitting up on that teaching chair with a nice sort of flower decoration behind them, we see them to be almost like a god. And so when they tell us stuff, we kind of feel like we have to accept it. And not only that, there's a room full of people who have great faith in this guy. He's the teacher. And if I contradict them, that's going to be a bit uncomfortable, right? Especially if we have conversations in the tea room after the teaching, and I disagree with something the teacher said, then people are going to look down on me. They're not going to like that. Or I'll lose faith in the community. And that's why it's such a danger, spiritual communities and personality cults, because it suppresses your personal experience. And meditation is about personal understanding. It's about cultivation, habituation, personally, and not towards a fallacy, but towards the ultimate truth. So, how did the Buddha describe enlightenment? And there's this famous quote that we get after achieving enlightenment. Then the Buddha made this quote and said, profound and peaceful, free of elaboration, uncompounded luminosity. I have found a nectar-like Dharma, yet if I were to teach it, no one would understand. So I shall remain silent here in the forest. So this explains everything about awakening and enlightenment. These are flawless words, especially the bit about even if I told people, they wouldn't understand it. So it's obviously not easy. The Buddha had the miracle of speech. That means the Buddha could talk in one language and everybody would hear it in their own language. Not only that, he could say one sentence and everybody would hear that sentence in the way that was most appropriate for their understanding. So if the Buddha couldn't make people understand this profound point, then we can see that it's not in any way easy. So you shouldn't take this to be a simple point. Don't oversimplify the Dharma. And don't think it's easy. And also, don't get trapped into these two negative types of meditation called dullness and agitation. What you're looking for there is the middle way. It's the middle way of meditation. Thank you for your undivided attention, and I'll see you next time.